Thank you very much for being here this morning for this table, this debate on reskilling. How difficult is it and what an opportunity it is for the coming years. It's a very important session because, you know, in France we have this high unemployment rate, and at the same time we have 200,000 or 300,000 jobs that are still open because the employers say they can't find the people with the right skills. So this reskilling issue is really central. But at the same time, this an allocation of skills and job is really the tip of the iceberg, because McKinsey recently published a research saying that 60 million to 375 million people will need reskilling by 2030 because of the changes of the job, because of the changes in the economy, because of technology, because of globalization. So it's only the start of the story. So today we will debate on what basic skills we need, you know, to be able to face all this lifelong training, and how to be able to get it and to get this new skill and to go back to school during all our life, which is not so easy, how it should be organized, and in which condition this reskilling can be efficient. And before starting the debate, we wanted to ask you a question, to a polling in the audience, to know what you think about reskilling. This retraining, upskilling, reskilling, all lifelong, do you think today, as it is organized, do you think that it works? Or on the contrary, and the opposite, do you think that it doesn't work? So I think you might have a possibility to answer that poll. I don't know, have you been told how to answer this? To participate with the BCast device? Can someone help me on this? Because okay, well, you can connect on this. If it's too complicated anyway, when we will start debating on this, I will ask you to answer by raising your hands. Maybe it will be easier. So I will, our first question, the first thing we're going to debate is what are the skills that students need to have, you know, when they come out of school to be prepared for this lifelong training. So I will introduce each of our panelists by giving them the floor. Shay Gopal, maybe we will go first. You're Executive Director of Global Apprenticeship Network, which is a private-public partnership to look at all the different models of training, reskilling. And what do you think when you see, well, maybe you can tell us how many countries you work with at Global Apprenticeship Network, and from what your experience, what do you think, which skills should students be given when they go out of school or out of university to be able to cope with this new world?
Well, first of all, good morning. Coming from the Global Apprenticeship Network, we're a public-private partnership, and so we're a lot of employers, we're employer-driven, but also at the country level, we're with the social partners, the governments working together. We're in 12 countries now, from large countries such as the United States and Turkey, emerging markets, to Malawi, Tanzania, Argentina, Colombia, Mexico. When we started out the GAN, there really was about skills for business and jobs for youth. And there is this skills mismatch. And so many people tend to think of the skills that are needed today are technical skills. So many, we see all this youth unemployment and now adult unemployment, and yet 40% of the employers are saying they can't find the talent they need. So there's obviously a skills mismatch. So initially when we started, we thought, oh, these companies are going to be saying they need IT skills, they need better STEM, they need this, they need that. Ironically, the employers are saying what they need are the soft skills. And I'm talking about collaboration, communication skills, working in teams, critical thinking, not just knowing your technical skills, but how do you apply this in this ever-ending sort of change environment that we're in. And lastly, creativity, to be able to think out of the box and to use some of those skills and those technical skills and adapt them to a new environment. And particularly as we go on to the discussion on lifelong learning, how do I learn to learn?
Thank you. Amy Goldstein, you're a reporter at the Washington Post, and you had a fantastic experience. You went to Janesville, a small city where a big automotive factory was making the economy live globally, and when this plant closed, workers had to find new jobs, retrain, and you wrote an amazing book about this story. You will tell us more about the book later, but from your experience, both as a reporter and from this story in Janesville, what skills do you think are important to get out of school when you get out of school?
Well, thank you, and I'm very glad to be here in Paris at the OECD for my first time. So, as you say, I began thinking about this question of job skills when I decided to take a very close-up look through the lens of this small city in Wisconsin at what happens to people and texture of a community when good work goes away. And it very, very swiftly became clear to me that the immediate sequel question is, if people are falling out of the middle class, can they climb back up? And what does it take for them to climb back up if they can do it? And one of the reasons why I picked Janesville, Wisconsin, was it has a small college that specializes in vocational training. So this seemed to the good. And one of the things that I learned was that people were really looking for ways to replace their wages. Both the college counselors and people at a local job center that exists in many communities across the United States were trying very hard to do aptitude testing and interest testing to see if people were no longer on an assembly line, what kind of work might they really wish they had been doing all along, what might they be good at. And what the college found was that people, when these factory workers were coming back to school, were less interested in what they might be good at than where jobs might exist, and particularly what kind of work might approach the $28 an hour that they had been making on the General Motors assembly line. And what I also learned quickly was that before people could begin to study, they really had to figure out how to go from being a factory worker, which they'd had, in many cases, decades of experience, to being a student when they were traumatized, having lost this work they thought were going to last their lifetime, when they hadn't been students for, if they were in their 30s or 40s or even 50s, more than half their lifetime. They may not have been good at being students in the first place, which is why good factory work was appealing to them. And as I began talking with people at the college, they told me that they were shocked by some of the things that they didn't know that these returning factory workers didn't know how to do. So for instance, the instructors quickly discovered that these folks often didn't have computer skills. So there were people who were starting to drop out of classes because they weren't allowed to write papers longhand. So the college started running computer boot camps. So there were all kinds of creative things that the college had to figure out on the fly how to do so that people would be equipped to learn.
Thank you very much. Hassan Youssouf, you're president of the Canadian Labour Congress, so you will give us the point of view of the unions on these skills that students should have when they go out of school or out of university to be prepared for this lifelong training issue in their life.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be here. And of course, this is a very topical issue that every country is struggling. It's not just here in Europe. Same thing in Canada, United States. I mean, fundamentally, I think that we've seen an economy that is not the same as what it used to be 30, 40 years ago. And workers are now having to deal with the reality that your jobs is not going to be forever. You're going to go through many career paths before you get to your retirement if you're fortunate enough to get there. And more importantly, as you will cross many of those paths, you're going to need a variety of skills, of course, to succeed. What we're seeing again for older workers, far too many lack basic skills, which is literacy and numeracy skills, able to do the basic things we would expect of them, because they're the ones that are the most vulnerable in losing their jobs in the current readaptation of the workplace that's going on, and also in the context that a lot of changes that are happening in traditional jobs, so workers are going to, of course, have to figure out where their new employment is coming from. There's an important aspect of all of this is the important role that unions have to play, because within our workplace we sit and bargain with employers consistently as to how they could provide training for their workers to ensure they can keep upgrading their skills. And what we're seeing to a large extent, while employers complain a lot about what workers don't have, many of them are not investing their own dollars in trying to train their own people to ensure they're going to have the skills necessary to adapt as their workplace continue to change. The last point I would make, of course, is that government have an important role to play in this. It's government role to bring unions and employers, educators to sit down and figure out how do we continue to devise training to ensure that all workers are going to have the basic foundational skills as they continue to deal with the challenges with the job market, which are changing on a constant basis. Because the company, I started out working for General Motors, so I understand very much that I had to have. But in the 40 years of my lifelong working experience, that was only one part of it. I did 3 apprenticeships because I was fortunate, because back then you could do that with an employer. Today, if you're fortunate to get 1 apprenticeship, much less 3 apprenticeship. In addition to that, of course, the employer paid for most of my training. I got government subsidy for my training. In addition to have the employer made up the difference between what the government did not pay me. But more importantly, they encouraged me to continue to adapt my skills, whereas in today's job market, and most employers, that's not a reality.
Thank you. You gave me the perfect transition to give the floor to Jean-Michel Blanquer, the French Minister of Education. Thank you, Mr. Blanquer, to have joined us. And so we were talking about the skills that, when all these workers will have to reskill, upskills all their life long. What should they have as basic skills when they come out of school or out of universities? And this is what you're obviously working on. So
yes. Thank you very much. Je vais parler en français.
I'm going to be speaking French. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me here. I think this is a fundamental issue, and I should say it's at the very heart of what our government has been doing since Emmanuel Macron was elected, because the expression free up and is something that the president uses a lot, and I think you can see this clearly in this subject, because the aim is to allow everybody to free themselves through training, through education, in a constantly changing world where adaptation is a key word, and where everybody has to find their own freedom, their own life plans, thanks to these skills. So that's fundamental. And I think it's illustrated in different ways. First of all, I have to recall this, but it may seem obvious today, we are living through major revolutions when you compare what's happening today with the history of humanity. So we must never underestimate this very, very unique situation we're living through, particularly the case when you look at the different digital revolutions going on. I mean, there are several different revolutions going on, and they have different consequences on training and on jobs. It's got scientific revolutions taking on. So I often refer to cognitive sciences, because they tell us an awful lot about how children learn skills, but also tell us a lot about how adults learn, and not necessarily the same ways of learning. In fact, when some things are enrooted, we know full well from experience, and it's been proved that if learning to read doesn't take place early, it's far harder later on in life, and you have to adapt learning methods to adults, because it's not the same kind of learning. So these contexts, the scientific revolution, the technological revolutions that we're living through, have a huge social impact, and that's what brings us together. We need to see what kind of economy and society we need to live in, we want to live in, and from a systemic and consistent point of view, where all of the factors have to be in line, and we need to have a short-term vision, thinking about immediate retraining, but also a long-term vision, thinking about the kind of society and civilization we want to have. Let me begin with the second, which is by no means the easiest question. I think that the most important thing is primary school teaching. And when the entire day I keep telling people, read, count, help others, I think it's absolutely essential for future generations. If we don't have these basic skills of reading, counting at the beginning of life, then it's going to be very hard later on in life. Even if you want to take on board other skills, you have to be able to have access to access, if I can put it like that. Basic understandings which open doors to other kinds of training. It's very simple to say. I mean, it's very easy to say, but I have to repeat it again and again, because sometimes I get the impression that we move to the second or third phase of this logic without having guaranteed this first phase. And so my main aim as Minister of Education, and again we're thinking of the short, medium and long term, is that in a country like France, comparable to most other countries of the OECD from this point of view, give or take a couple of percentage points, where a fifth of children come out of primary school without having those basic skills. So, thanks to international comparison, thanks to work done by the OECD, we can make progress there, and also thanks to other work. So that's fundamental. The other thing I wanted to say was, close to this issue of reskilling, is retraining for adults. And yesterday, in fact, I was presenting the vocational training reform which is taking place. It's the second most important reform, I think, in my ministry, when you think about apart from the primary school reform. And this reform of vocational training involves different things. It concerns ongoing training and initial teaching. Let me quickly explain what it's all about. First of all, and again, it's important to say things in simple terms, but sometimes we tend to forget it. The campus effect, the place, which is so important. When we talk increasingly about remote teaching, learning, virtual learning, and so on, we tend to forget the effects of a location. Here we are together. We're a human group together. That's important. It wouldn't be the same thing if we were doing a video conference or if we were talking on a phone. Of course you do need to, or online. Of course you can do things online. But when you're talking about reskilling, about getting people back to work, the human dimension, the dimension of the factor about the place is really important, and it has to. We need to make the most of it, which is why I was talking about the campus effect so much yesterday. In the summary, I say we want to have these kind of vocational farms where we can teach people, as it were, encourage people to learn. Or a Harvard, as it were. I like to think of it as this way of teaching people. So in reskilling, there is this challenge of links, basic training and continued training. I've often seen that mixing different groups is really useful, both for those in initial training and also for those who are learning later in life, for different reasons, but particularly because those who are receiving later training are, in a sense, a locomotive for the younger ones, because they're more motivated, and for them it's incredibly encouraging, and that's fundamental, I think. You should never see these issues as being a form of charity to people who are living a different moment in their lives, because this vertical logic doesn't really work. It has to be seen as a way of encouraging, giving something more to individuals. And when somebody of 40 has to retrain, it's good for them to give them a responsibility, giving them a responsibility to a younger person. That's incredibly important. and I've perhaps spoken too much. I can see that from your eyes. But this second point, I think, is important.
And so I'll end with that, because we could spend hours talking about that. Mixing up different audiences is an essential challenge. And one last thing that is present in what I said about vocational training, apart from mixing up institutions and different ages, you also need to have a good match between skills. And here, the issue of the digital revolution and the environmental transition are essential. We need to define future curricula, because that cuts across almost all future occupations. And here we need to promote skills. And what makes the connection between all that is the human factor. The notion of mentorship is essential. I was speaking with a French MP this morning, talking about a French territory which is marginalized, rural and poor, deindustrialized, and we were talking about giving jobs back to people after 40. And what that MP was saying is what we've been saying. It's not just a matter of matching supply and demand. These are people who are going to tap into different kinds of skills so that they can find skills that can be related to a job, but it's also a matter of attitudes. So mentorship is, I think, a key challenge for reskilling, for lack of a better word in French. Thank you so much.
Sorry, Catherine Collinson, you're president of Transamerica Institute and of the Egan Center for Longevity and Retirement, and you have a very long-term perspective on this issue of reskilling, because you work on how do gaps in career affects retirement, and how can we reskill and be better trained to go to the end of our career and retire with a full pension, and not retire before the retirement age, because we are laid off worker, because we don't have the skills required for the job. So from your perspective, what do you think about what everyone said about skills, and what the minister said about his approach of lifelong training?
Well, first of all, I agree with everything that everyone has said. It is absolutely imperative in this day and age that if you don't keep up, you are at risk of being left behind. And we've already seen and heard too many stories about people who have been left behind. I'd like to share with you some findings from a new survey that we released today. I'll hold up the cover. It's the 7th annual Aegon Retirement Readiness Survey. And this year's survey, the title of the report is The New Social Contract, a Blueprint for Retirement in the 21st Century. And one of the questions that we asked that I was so stricken by is we asked people about the megatrends that are happening today and how they're impacting their plans for retirement. And one of the megatrends, we asked many, everything from increases in longevity to cyber threats to climate change. Only 1 in 5 identified changing labor markets as a megatrend that could impact their retirement. And as a retirement researcher, we know that any disruptions in our working lives can have even greater consequences when we retire in older age. And with a response rate of about just 1 in 5, it means 2 things. 1, we need to raise awareness of the issue, or secondly, people may sort of understand it but are overwhelmed and don't know how to deal with it. So in terms of life skills, 1 is recognizing the issues at hand. The other is planning for the unexpected. We've heard a lot about resilience and adaptability. From a financial perspective, in our survey, we, with their permission, asked the big 3 financial literacy questions developed by Drs. Olivia Mitchell and Anna Maria Lusardi. 3 very, very, very basic financial questions. one about compound interest, another about inflation, and the last about risk diversification. And among the 16,000 respondents spanning 15 countries in the survey, only 3 in 10 answered all 3 questions correctly. And if we are going to plan for our future, including disruptions in employment, as well as times where we're going to be self-employed to fill those gaps when we are employed and to save and prepare for our retirement, it's absolutely imperative that we have the basic accounting skills, as you called them. And then planning skills as well. So I'll leave it at that. But those are some of the big findings in our survey.
Thank you very much. I wonder if we have the results of this polling question. Does reskilling work or not, according to you? So do we have something from BCAST or? No, so maybe we'll do it, yeah? So most of you think that reskilling work. And maybe I'd like Amy Goldstein to explain us what she saw in Janesville when all these General Motors workers needed reskilling. And, you know, Amy will give us a short answer now, but if you want to know more about this experience and what she saw in Janesville and about her book, she will be giving a lecture on this book at this afternoon at 2:45.
Thank you. So first of all, I was interested that you mentioned, Mr. Deindustrialization, because that's the context in which I was taking a close-up look at this small southern Wisconsin town. And you also mentioned that it's not just about skills, but it's about attitude. And I think that part of what I learned is it's not just about skills and attitude, but it's also about identity. Because these auto workers have been auto workers since they were teenagers for the most part, since they got out of high school. This was a plant that had been around since just after World War I. So their fathers and grandfathers and aunts and uncles all had thought that this was the best kind of working class job you could possibly have. And suddenly, about 9,000 jobs vanished in 2008 and 2009 during what we in the United States call the Great Recession, and the rest of you tend to call the global financial crisis. I tried to understand what was going on with job retraining, both by doing very intimate kind of interviewing with some individual workers who were trying to transform themselves, and also by letting my inner nerd come out by working with 2 labor economists on a statistical analysis of what was happening with people who did and did not retrain in this community. So let me just talk a little bit about both of those. What I found from individuals was that people didn't always go back to school right away. The people who had worked at General Motors itself, unlike people who worked at many supplier companies that had grown up around this big old factory, and those people also lost their jobs, but the GMers themselves got extra union benefits for about a year or 2. So they waited thinking maybe their jobs would come back, and then reluctantly went back to school when it seemed that they weren't. And I want to tell you about the experience of one man whose story and whose family I discuss in this book over the course of about 5 years after this plant closing. His name is Jared Whitaker, and he had worked at General Motors for 13 years. And when the plant jobs ended, he thought this was great. He thought he'd get a little earned vacation while he was collecting union pay, and then another job would come along. And he very reluctantly went back to school. Like many people, he went back to school to train to become a utility lineman, climbing utility poles, because those were jobs that were supposed to come open because people were retiring from those jobs. And Jared started back at school. He was completely terrified, like every single person I got back to know. He was really scared about how he was going to be a student. He was completely embarrassed at the idea of sitting at the kitchen table doing homework along with his 3 children after dinner. And he lasted a couple of weeks as a student. His instructor in the first class divided people into groups and told them to go outside in the grounds of this college and dig a 10-foot deep hole, and then place a practice utility pole into the ground and take turns climbing up it. And when it was Jared's turn to climb up, he got to the top, and then he lost his footing and slid part of the way down, really scraping up his chest. And this so scared him, and he thought, if I can, I can survive this kind of a fall. It's embarrassing, but I can survive. But what if I'm at the top of a real utility pole and I get hurt? What good am I doing myself or my family then? And he dropped out of school. And other people I knew dropped out of school for different reasons. Some people stayed, about, on balance, statistically, about 1/3 of the roughly 2,000 laid off factory workers who went to this tiny college in the couple of years after all these jobs vanished actually completed the program they had started, whether it was a certificate program or a 2-year degree program. 1/3 completed. So let me tell you a little bit about the data. And what we did, I'm going to try to be technical but brief about this, is working with 2 labor economists, we pulled together unemployment claims records and wage records, and the college was very cooperative and gave us student data. And we put all those data sets together, stripped away all the names so we wouldn't know who was who. And through this, we were able to look at people who had lost their jobs in this part of southern Wisconsin around the time that the Great Recession began, and then where they were by 2011, 2012. And what the data found in synopsis is that people who had not gone back to school were by mid-2011 more likely to have a job than those who retrained. If they had a job, they were more likely to be working all 4 seasons of the year. And people who had not gone back to school had a smaller pay drop from before the recession to then. So those are pretty sobering findings and counterintuitive findings. And I don't think that they, and as you can imagine, the data don't say why this was the pattern. And we, I should say, sliced and diced these data in all kinds of ways to look just at people who completed their programs, people who completed programs just in those fields where the college and the local advice givers for laid off workers thought that people had the best jobs of finding work after retraining. We tried to look at all kinds of ways and we could not shake this basic pattern. And as I said, the numbers don't explain the reasons for these phenomena, but I spent a lot of time talking to people both locally and people who studied job retraining to try to get some ideas about what accounts for this. And I think that it's a combination of 3 things. Partly, it may be that people who could find work quickly did, and other people retrained. It's partly, I think, a function that people who went back to school, even if they succeeded, one of the people whose stories I follow in my book was a top union leader who went back to school to study human resources management. So speaking of identity, it was a very hard transition for him to go from being a union guy to a management guy. But he made his peace with it and decided that if he could help people from the labor side, he could help people from the management side. There's a moment in my story when he's terrified about admitting this to his dad, what he's about to do, because his father also had been a labor union. His father actually was very understanding and did not say that he was going to the dark side, which is what this man called Mike feared his father might say. So he succeeds. He finishes his program. He gets his job. He starts out at the bottom of the ladder, working overnight shift, making half of his former factory pay. So that's the second phenomenon. People start at the bottom of a new rung, bottom rung of a new ladder. And finally, out of this recession, nobody knew how long it was going to take for jobs to return. And it took much longer out of this bad economic time than it had out of past recent recessions, at least in the United States. So the head of the job center ends up feeling very guilty that he's given all these people advice. There's lots of federal training money. He sends them back to school thinking this is good for them. And at least in that context in southern Wisconsin, not many jobs were waiting for them at the end.
Thank you. Shay Gopal, from what you see in your network, what are the conditions for reskilling to work best?
So first of all, at the Global Apprenticeship Network, when we first started out, we said we were skills for business and jobs for youth. And we find now, after 4 years, that it's skills for all. And while the apprenticeship model is something that we often think of as young people, 16 years old, 18 years old, the gold standard, like in Switzerland and Germany, what we're finding is what we're calling innovative apprenticeships, pre-apprenticeship programs, part-time apprenticeship programs can actually be used for reskilling. So actually, when you ask your question about reskilling, I said maybe yes, maybe no. And I think the problem is that if we think of reskilling, and we tend to think of it in silos, the government needs to pay, and the person needs to do this, this is where we're going to fail. And we need to bring the public and the private around the table with the social partners, really discussing what is relevant, but what is the need. And I think we have some good examples. I don't think all employers are engaged. We're lucky to have some great examples of Randstad, who's doing some great work in the Netherlands, but also in Spain. AT&T has a fantastic program where they now reskill people who are losing their jobs. And so if you're going to lose your job, your last year, you do a part-time apprenticeship in a new area, in a new field. And I do believe that what Mr. the Ministre was saying was that that human side, and this is why I really believe in apprenticeships, is the mentor, the teacher, being practical. The Z generation today, ironically, does not want to work at home in front of their computer. They actually have had enough of computers. They see the work environment as being where they can communicate, where they can learn. They actually don't want meetings online, but they want it in person. So I think this is a really important element that we might be losing because we tend to think in this world of AI that you can learn everything on e-learning. And those are fantastic tools. But some of our companies are saying, even with e-apprenticeships, 40% is online, but 60% has to be with that sort of human contact. So what I would say is that while apprenticeships, we look at, as I said, these really well-wheeled systems like Switzerland, Germany, etc., there's a culture there. Employers actually feel that they are part of the solution. And it's just not the government that should give the education, nor should it be just one group, just the teachers, etc. But it really is a collaboration. And I can't stress that enough, because when we've set up these national networks, and the first one was in Turkey, and then we went to Argentina and Spain, I am absolutely shocked when we go into these meetings and we have the Minister of Labor, by the way, not always education, because there's a link. There's a huge link, but they're not always there, and they're in different ministries. And then you bring the universities and the technical colleges and the employers, and most importantly, young people and the parents who advise the kids on what journey they should take. They're not all talking. And the university is saying, oh, yeah, we heard the employers, this is what they need. And then the employers say, when did you ever discuss with us the curriculum? And this is a very serious issue, because I actually see governments spending enormous amount of money. They're putting a lot of resources in education, but quite honestly, I'm not sure we're getting really what we want out of it. And I think the reskilling is a really good example that, yes, it's everybody's responsibility. And I go back to, it's the responsibility of the individual as well. Not everyone who's losing their job at 50 years old find it easy to think, I'm going to have to be like my kids and go back to school. That wasn't part of their education. That's not what their parents did. And so it's very hard for older people to actually think that now I actually have to learn from young people. And I think that's what's interesting about the apprenticeship model, is this intergenerational discussion of the young person can help you, but you can also learn from the wise adult as well. So maybe I'll stop there.
This is very interesting. Hassan Yusuf, if training or reskilling is everybody's responsibility, what is the best governance for this system, and what role should unions play in this governance according to you? We used to have a live to be used to live employment, and in this case it was easy. It was your company, your employer, that had the responsibility to reskill you. But today we're going to change. We're already changing employers. So who is in charge, and how can we have a better governance?
Well, the governance modelists work, the ones that have been touched on, Germany and Switzerland and other countries, it's a tripartite model, where the parties actually start from the perspective that each party's got something to commit. The employer does, government, of course, and equally unions playing an important role. But the challenge, of course, in trying to identify as you're dealing with somebody losing their job or somebody having to prepare that 10 years from now that job may not be there is a whole other thing. And I think the challenge that we face quite often, we don't know what the job market is going to look like 5 or 10 years down the road. Despite the good efforts of government, quite often they don't know what they're talking about. Well, let me give you one example. The care economy is the most fastest growing economy in the world. But yet, you never hear this conversation come out of government's mouth. And why? I think it's a gender bias, because it's women who will do that work. And fundamentally, how do we help them with the skills they need? And how do we invest in that job market that's going to help women not only enter, most of them are doing it, it doesn't have to be that way, there's a huge prejudice, but more importantly, how do we see that as a future growth of employment where people are going to have to work? Look around this audience, a lot of us are going to be there, we're going to need help. And how do we look after that generation of new workers? And so we spend a lot of time talking about the job market, but it's more from a male perspective. And I think that in itself is problematic because to a large extent, longevity, we're all going to live longer. Women are now half the workforce in Canada, so we've got to spend more time talking about their needs, not just about men's needs. It is true that men that lose their job at 50 statistically have a much more difficult time reskilling, and a large part of that comes with the fear of having to try something new. So I think it's critical for employers who have the foresight is to help workers adapt to that reality. We're going through right now, we're going to phase out all of our coal-fired generation in Canada. So we're in the process as a co-chairing a task force looking at what do we do with these workers? Where are they going to work? What skills are they going to need? And how does government play a role to help them with the re-skills they're going to need? And how do we deal with the gaps in the community? Because if that industry disappears, what replaces that in the community? And climate change is a fundamental challenge for us. So how do we get workers that's going to provide the skills going to help us adapt to meet our climate change needs? These are very different kind of work, but we need to start planning for it because fundamentally everything that we do are going to have to adapt to new reality. We're going to use less carbon. Homes and buildings are going to have to be refit and retrofit. What skills are needed for there and how do we help workers achieve those skills in the process? But part of that is to have a tripartite process for union playing a role where we're sitting down planning and anticipating what is going to happen with the job market. And the last point I would make, and this is to do as a compliment to the young people, we have the most educated generation in history. And yet they consistently face the highest unemployment. And I think the large part because what they were told when they were going to colleges and university, the kind of jobs that was going to be there for them when they graduate, only to find out that they exit university and none of those jobs are there, and then we can't seem to tell them or place them where they're going to have to find that new employment. And I think it's critical that we don't lose sight of that this younger generation is highly educational and adaptable. But we need to spend more time with government policies to figure out how to get them in a job market and keep them in the job market. Because in absence of that, we don't have a choice. I mean, I can tell you in Canada, every one of them that graduate has a secondary degree, but yet they're unemployed. And they've been unemployed for the longest period. From the 2008 recession continuing on, they've had double-digit unemployment compared to adults, which if you'd had single-digit unemployment even during that whole recession period.
Thank you. Jean-Michel Blanquer, in France, you are working on training in elementary school, and at the same time, the Minister of Labor is working on formation professionnelle, lifelong training. Do you talk to each other? Is there a continuity between the two reforms? How do you articulate them?
Oui, nous parlons beaucoup.
Yeah, we talk a lot about these things. In fact, it was said that how important it was earlier on. I think it's new, actually, in France, thanks to this new government, and various different ideas of essential cooperation between two areas have been mooted. Ministry of Labour and Ministry of Education, to cite two. We have a new law on vocational training, unemployment benefits, and apprenticeships, which is being debated as I speak in the National Assembly. And of course, I'm going to have to defend this, which is interesting. It's being borne by the Ministry of Labour and Ms. Pénicaud, who will be presenting most of this law, but I will be there too as well, talking about certain issues related to it, because we've worked on this together. And yesterday, I announced a reform which I think, as I was saying earlier on, is one of the two most important that I have to introduce. And I announced it, obviously, in total sync with what the Minister of Labour was doing, because we need to move away from this very typical French cleavage between scholastic vocational training, 700,000 students, and apprenticeships, which represents 300,000 people in secondary school level, but also tertiary. We believe that there should be more, of course, involved in apprenticeships. In the past, what happened was that you would have clashes of conflicts of interest between work and education, the worlds of work and education, and in people's minds. You can see there's a conflict between what's involved in apprenticeship and what's involved in vocational training. We have made very clear that there'll be more apprenticeships in vocational training in the future in order to push, thanks to these two reforms. So vocational training will make more of the growth in apprenticeship. It's absolutely essential in all countries, not just in France, to get the Ministry of Labour and the Ministry of Education working together so that we can be forward-thinking about the jobs of the future. And obviously, nobody has a crystal ball to know exactly what those jobs will be, but we need to think hard together about the skills of the future and major changes in the economy. And at least we can be agents of change, because what's important to say is that the economy is not something which comes out of the blue, falls on our heads like a meteorite. We don't have any influence over it. No, it's up to us to shape the economy. It's an economy which to a great extent will be a training economy, a learning economy, systemically, like an ecosystem. And I think that in the 21st century, we need to think very hard about the role of health, and the role of education in our societies, of course, which is perhaps quite conventional, but also in our economy, which is perhaps newer. In other words, see education about health not only as a basic social challenge, two pillars of a society, but also as economic stakes, which can shape the new economy. There is an economy of education, there's an economy of health. And they will be increasingly important when it comes to GDP in France, which is why the OECD is so a fascinating place to talk about these issues, because we can't talk about this in a very, very pigeonholed way, talk about education in one place and labour and work in the other. No. What kind of economy are we going to be shaping in the future through education and health as populations age, which is good news. We shouldn't see it as bad news. It's an opportunity to transform this challenges of education and health. That's how we should see it, I believe. That's how I'd answer your question, in fact. We need to have a systemic vision, a complex vision, which presupposes cooperation between different ministries and sectors. And you, in a sense, are leading the largest company in France, if I can put it like this, as a teacher. So do you think it's easy to prepare people for the new challenges? You announced yesterday that some areas, professional, vocational schools will be closed or reduced in size, so you have to retrain the teachers who are teaching in those schools. Is that easy to do? Can we make progress there? Well, let me be a little bit provocative, and I'd say yes, it's feasible. I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's feasible. Sometimes we say it's the third largest company in the world, education, but I think that's not true. But anyway, we're talking about 1 million people, the teachers. 1 million people, that's a lot of people. And we always have this image, very sort of sketchy image, of what this institution actually is. But in actual fact, every individual is unique. A teacher, by definition, is somebody who has quite well fleshed out training, independent thinker. That's good. And so you can't generalize about teaching. And we have to have a very, very personalized, tailor-made approach. But teachers are those who tend most to go for self-training. I mean, as a teacher, they constantly are retraining themselves. And generally speaking, a teacher is linked to development of knowledge. So that'd be my major message, I think, that in a world where we have to still defend the concept of progress through knowledge, it's important to say that teachers embody that. And if they are the ones who embody it, teachers in primary schools, for example, I want their ongoing training to be stronger and to be linked to cognitive science and other disciplines. So this challenge of constant retraining or reskilling is very fundamental to teachers, but in a sense it's also easier to develop it for teachers than it is for other people in other professions. Now, it's true that there are also issues of developments in the body of teaching, and we might come up against resistance, union resistance, but when it comes to vocational training, you cited that, and I'm happy to talk about that. We have to be careful. I mean, what the press might be saying about it, they tend to skew the debate, but I'm not going to say that there are going to be jobs removed. Quite the opposite, in fact. And I'd like to say that that's not the case here and now, but what is coming is, if you look about the interests of the pupils, we need to stop sending too many people to training courses which are perhaps useless and send them to training courses which will allow them to find their jobs, which means, of course, changing training for the teachers. But that should be stimulating for them, because they're not going to lose their jobs. I mean, they're going to have to be learning new, interesting things and be even more useful for the students that they're training. So I think one should be enthusiastic and see it as a stimulus. That's what I'm trying to get over. The truth is that every time I go to schools and I talk about this with teachers, basically, I have to say, they subscribe to it. As long as the people don't feel they're being challenged or that their jobs are being threatened, and that's not the case. If they feel they're being stimulated, encouraged to strive even more, then I think changing the institution will be possible thanks to personalization of trajectories that we're trying to ensure for the students, but for those who are teachers.
Civil servants, so they don't have to worry about their job security. I've read your questions on BCAST. Most of them were on governance and on soft skills, and I think the question on soft skills, Andreas Schleicher, who you all know, will answer them in this wrap-up intervention. Andreas, please. So you know that Andreas has completely changed these education questions, lifelong training questions with the ranking, the PISA and the adult skills rankings that OECD publishes, and which obliges all of us to enhance the quality of education. Andreas?
Thanks, Sophie, and I really enjoyed the conversation. I mean, lifelong learning is something that is so easy to talk about and so hard to do, really. In a way, sort of, we used to learn to do the work, and now learning has become the work. I think that's really what we are struggling with. And the only people that's going to, accept that their job may disappear one day is the people who feel they have the skills and the knowledge to find a new one or create a new one. And Amy, I was really struck by your stories of, people who were left out. And in a way, we are still not good enough to prepare people in advance. We always start to think about reskilling when people fall through the cracks, and that's sort of something I think has become far too narrow. What's the next steel industry? We know, the kind of things that are easy to teach have also become easy to digitize these days. And in a way, the learning part may still be the easy part of lifelong learning. Our capacity to unlearn and to relearn when the context changes, that's maybe the real challenge. We've grown comfortable with so many things, and in school we teach people our truths of today rather than helping them to question the established wisdom of our times. Think forward, anticipate, be open to the novelty. What's going to be the next way of thinking, the next way of working? I think this is where we have to really become better at. And Shia, you brought up the point of curriculum design. I think you made a really important point that what we teach really needs to become a kind of whole of society process. But I just warn, employers have one important voice, but they shouldn't be the only voice. They are very good in telling you what they need today. They're actually not very good in what we need for tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. And I think that's something where societies need to think harder about what's the long term really looking out. And this is sort of, one of the reasons why our school systems have become sort of a mile wide and an inch deep is precisely because every day we have a new idea and we put it on top and then we expect people to do all of this. I think the other point that came across really very clear was, the people need to take more responsibility for their own learning. That's really, really hard. We have a kind of consumer attitude to education. You sit in the classroom, you listen to a teacher, but actually we need to become actors. And as Hassan also said, employers need to build that into working and learning needs to become really integrated. It's no longer a separate world. It's something that we need to really build together. And then lifelong learning starts really early. And Minister Blanke made very clear, if we don't lay the right foundations, lifelong learning becomes an uphill struggle. And our data actually support that in very powerful ways. It's almost depressing to read those statistics. No? And this is something where social background tends to reinforce those kinds of dynamics. No? If you come from a wealthy background, you're going to find many open doors to success in life. That's very clear. But if you come from a poor background, you have only one chance in life, and that is a good score. Sort of, if we don't lay those foundations, I think we're going to really face a hard time. And then, on the what question, I'm not sure we got very far, really. I think what is clear is that education has won the race with technology throughout history, but I'm not so sure it's going to last for the future. And I think the role of soft skills that we have brought out, and I'm glad you brought out that this is not just about practical skills, applied skills, but also about attitudes and values. No? Our capacity to think for ourselves and to work with others with empathy, to sort of build kind of relationships, I think is going to be, in one way, artificial intelligence forces us to think much harder these days what it means to be human. And actually, rather than complementing the artificial intelligence or substituting the artificial of computers, we should think harder about what it means to be human and how we can complement those kinds of capacities. But I think that's going to be another discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Just to remind the audience that you will be presenting your book, World Class, How to Build 21st Century School System, tomorrow at 11:15. I'm really sorry to see you standing in the room, so I know this topic and our participants were of such quality that many of you would have liked to be seated and to listen to them much longer, but the schedule is the schedule. Thank you very much.